what we will be covering today. So firstly, we'll discuss the definition of what PLOS sees as publication ethics and the type of issues that we do come across both whilst an article is under assessment as well as once an article has been published. And we'll discuss what PLOS does to assess and address these kind of issues when they have been raised with the journal. Then we will be talking a little bit about what you in your role as editor can do to ensure high publication ethics standards across the PLOS journals, both whilst you are encountering these kind of issues during assessment and during peer review, as well as what you can do to help PLOS when you find issues either as a reader of a PLOS journal and you find an issue in an article that we have published, or if you are being approached by someone after an article has been published and they have questions about pub ethics concerns. And then finally, we will show you a bunch of resources that are available for all board members. And we'll have a quick Q&A session as well to answer some of your questions. And as Jenny has mentioned before, if you could please restrain to keep your questions to the topic of publication ethics. If you have any other questions regarding your role as an editor that are not specifically related to pub ethics, you can still ask them, but please send them in after the webinar so that we can focus on publication ethics specifically. So at PLOS, we use publication ethics as an umbrella term for a variety of different kind of issues, both of a scientific nature as well as an ethics nature. And all of these issues rely are focused on these three entities that are reliability and validity and integrity. These three entities are closely entwined and they are very important to maintain trust in the scientific record. So when we're talking about reliability, we're thinking on topics that have to do with the reproducibility of the study, the availability of the materials and data, and the accuracy and the transparency by which these topics have been discussed in an article. So when we're thinking of an issue, a publication ethics issue that might affect the reliability of a study, you could think of, for example, a study where authors find out that they have used a misidentified cell line or a contaminated cell line, or perhaps where they've used a reagent that was different from the reagent they thought it was. When we're talking about a topic such as validity, we're thinking about the accuracy of the study design, whether that actually tests the hypothesis, whether the correct statistical analyses have been used, and whether the appropriate conclusions have been drawn from the results that have been obtained during the study. So when we're talking about publication ethics concerns that affect the validity of a study, you could think of, for example, a situation where authors have been using a parametric test to test for non-normally distributed data, and as such, the statistical analysis is incorrect, and therefore the validity of the study is in question. And then finally, when we're talking about integrity of a study, we are looking at a very wide range of topics that range from authorship and data ownership, or plagiarism, or competing interests, or research and ethics, and whether people have actually obtained the correct ethics, and importantly also the integrity of the data that has actually been shown in an article. So when we're thinking of publication ethics concerns that might affect the integrity of a study, you could be thinking of, for example, a situation where authors have shown a blot that has been spliced, but they have not clarified that the blot has been spliced, and it's been presented as if it's one continuous blot. And this could be an issue that affects the integrity of the paper. Now, as a researcher and a board member, it's incredibly important that you are familiar with the publication ethics standards so that you can avoid these kind of common issues in your own articles, but also so that you can contribute to the community's efforts to uphold high integrity within the literature. However, and I will touch upon this again later on in the webinar, but it's incredibly important to keep in mind that most of the publication ethics breaches are the result of honest error or a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, as opposed to deliberate frauds or misconduct. And it's really important to keep that in mind, that the vast majority is just a genuine error. So publication ethics concerns can be raised during any stage of an article's life cycle. So they could be discovered by the journal staff during a submission check before an article's been sent out for peer review, or at the accept stage when the final quality assurance checks are being carried out. They could be raised by academic editors such as yourself or reviewers whilst you are evaluating the content of the scientific content of the article during the peer review stage. Or it could be raised by readers after an article has been published. And this could be on social media or on PubPeer or on other outlets. It could be that people contact us directly or that they contact you as the editor who's handled the article to raise concerns. PLOS will address any concerns that have been raised regarding PLOS articles, including concerns that have been raised with us by anonymous whistleblowers. But it is very important that these concerns are raised with the journal directly. If we are aware of issues that are being discussed on social media, we will try and open a case, but we simply do not have the resources to scour the whole of the internet for any kind of concerns that might be raised. So if you are aware of a concern that has been raised with an article, please do contact us via an email or by contacting the journal manager or something along those lines, so that we can then start an assessment of the concern. So PLOS is a member of the Committee on Publication Ethics, which is also known as COPE. And COPE is an organization, an international international organization that works across the industry and that has over 20 years of experience in setting guidance and giving feedback and advice for publishers and editors and authors on how to deal with publication ethics concerns. And as a member of COPE, PLOS has made a commitment to adhere to follow the guidelines of COPE when handling publication ethics concerns. So we've put the website for COPE on this slide. And when you go to the website, you'll be able to find a whole bunch of guidelines and flowcharts on how publication ethics issues should be addressed, or also how readers and authors can raise concerns with COPE if they think that the case hasn't been handled correctly, or if they think that they've not been treated fairly by a journal. Now, if you're looking at these flowcharts and at these guidelines, you can see that there are 4 key components to pretty much any type of publication ethics concern. And that is firstly to address the issue. It's incredibly important the journals address the issues, and if it turns out that there is no merit to the issue, that we've at least looked into it. Once the issue has been assessed and we've determined that there is sufficient merit to continue an inquiry, we will then contact the authors, or occasionally an editor or a reviewer to comment, but usually we will contact the authors first, explain the concerns that have been raised and ask them for a response, and potentially ask them for the original data underlying their results or for additional data to confirm their results. Once the assessment has been, once the response has been received by the journal, we will do an initial assessment, and we will then determine whether or not additional input is required from a subject area expert or from the institute. Sometimes this is not necessary. Sometimes issues can be resolved without any further input from board members, but this is usually when we might contact you for your advice when a response has been assessed and we need to know whether this is sufficient to resolve the concerns that have been raised. After the editorial assessment is complete, the journal will make a decision and will take the appropriate action based on the concerns that have been raised. If Jenny, if you can bring up the next poll question, please. To get an idea of what you might think are the most common issues in publication ethics, both before an article has been published and the type of concern you think is most common after an article has been published. And again, Jenny, if you think that we've received the answers, then please submit the poll results. Oh. Brilliant. So if we're looking at the most common type of publication ethic concern that is raised to PLOS prior to peer review, you all think that, or the vast majority of you think that the plagiarism is the most common issue. Other topics that you have raised are competing interest issues, image integrity concerns, dual publication or duplicate submission concerns, and authorship or data ownership concerns. And then when it comes to the most common type of publication ethics concern that is raised after an article's publication, the most popular answer here is competing interest issues, but other concerns that you have flagged are plagiarism, image integrity concerns, dual publication or duplicate submission concerns, and authorship or data ownership disputes. I will be talking through these on the next few slides, so then you'll find out what our most common issues are. So as can be seen on this slide, these are the most common pre-publication case, or this is a breakdown of the kind of pre-publication cases that we see at PLOS. Now they've been separated by color based on the type of issue, and by column based on the outcome of these cases. So if you are looking at a very small screen and you can't quite read the text, I'm going to specifically focus on the first two columns, the first column being resolved. In pre-publication cases, what we mean with resolved is the issue has been addressed in such a way that the article can proceed to or through peer review, or rejection, which is the second column, where the issues are of such a nature or the authors may not have responded or whatever, and we've not been able to consider the article further. So as you can see, that the most common issue that is raised prior to an article's publication that we can resolve are conflicts of interest, followed by dual publication concerns and duplicate submission concerns. When it comes to rejection, about a third of the cases that lead to rejection are concerns of duplicate submission, and about a quarter of these cases are dual publication. But as you can see, conflict of interest, although it is a big topic that comes up pre-publication, they can usually be resolved and usually the peer review can continue. However, when we're looking at post-publication cases at PLOS, the issues are a bit different. So here we're going to focus specifically on the first, second, and fourth column, which are retraction, correction, and expression of concern, respectively. And as you can see in each of these three outcomes on an article, the most common type of concern are actually image concerns. And then there are some data concerns to follow, but the vast majority of them are image concerns. Now, it's not necessarily surprising that this is the biggest topic, because image concerns is by itself an umbrella topic. It covers all kinds of concerns that could be raised with a figure, from a dual panel that has been accidentally duplicated, to undeclared splice lines, to partially overlapping panels, but it also includes concerns that are more serious regarding image and data fraud. And one of the key aspects that often decides whether or not an article can be corrected or can be resolved in a positive manner is whether the authors have retained the underlying images or the underlying data for their published results. And this is usually more common in the newer articles, but when a concern has been raised on an old article, this can be a very serious issue. And unfortunately, if the underlying data is no longer available, then PLOS usually cannot resolve the concerns, which may well lead to an expression of concern or even a retraction. So PLOS does do routine checks for some, but not all of the most commonly seen publication ethics issues. It's worth to keep in mind here that not every check is carried out on every journal, and the different journals might do certain checks at different points. So, for example, plagiarism and data duplication checks are being carried out by the journals, but some journals will carry these out at the time of submission, and other journals may not carry these out until the first revision is due in has been submitted. Or we will usually carry out checks on authorship and making sure that all authors have are aware of the article having been submitted, and we might do or we will do competing interest checks. However, that doesn't mean that you might not find additional issues, especially if it is a lab or an individual that you know, and you have concerns that a certain author should potentially not be included on an authorship list because you don't think that they've been involved in the study. Think of, for example, a department head who may not have anything to do with the lab and has probably not been involved in the study. Or if you think there are competing interests that the lab should have been declaring that they haven't, then please do reach out to us, because there's only so much that we as editors can check, especially when these are people that we don't know. So we'd rather that you flag it to us early and we can assess these during the peer review stage than that these concerns come up after an article has been published, as that makes it more difficult to resolve, and sometimes these kind of issues cannot be resolved at a later stage. Research ethics is also being checked by the journal, by the staff editors. We will usually check to make sure that authors have submitted ethics approvals that are required. However, the staff editors are not necessarily don't necessarily have the correct expertise in every single form of ethics: animal ethics, human ethics. Obviously, science that we publish at PLOS is very broad, and it's not possible for us to be an expert on every single different topic. So if an article comes to you and there are research ethics concerns, don't just assume that because it's passed the submission checks, it's okay. If you think that the research ethics that are described in the methodology are not correct and should be, or concerning for whatever reason, and should be looked into a bit more closely, then please do reach out to us, and we will investigate further to determine whether it's okay to proceed. There are issues that we do not tend to look at before publication. And such of these issues are, for example, dual submission. As a journal, unless there's a dual submission within PLOS, we are not aware of any submissions of the authors of the same article at a different journal at the same time if they've published it at PLOS. We only know when these articles are being published at around the same time. We do not have the means to actually check for these. So dual submissions, when we are aware of them during peer review, it is usually because you as an academic editor or a reviewer has been invited for multiple articles by the same authors that are very similar, and then you flag it to us so that we can look into it a little bit closer. The same when it comes to salami slicing. We sometimes can look into salami slicing concerns, especially when it comes to genomic studies where authors are focusing on only one or a couple of genes, and it is likely that they have spliced their study into multiple articles, each focusing on separate genes rather than making it one bigger study. But on the whole, we may not have the expertise to determine whether or not an article has been salami sliced early on during assessment. We might be able to see so once these articles have been published, but it's difficult for us to say right from the onset. So if you do come across an article where you think this looks like it might be spliced and there may be more data here that the authors have not included in the article, then do reach out to us. When it comes to data ownership, similar kind of concern, like we do not know who owns the data. We will have to assume that the authors own the data, but there's no way for us to check systematically. So data ownership concerns usually we are not made aware until an article has been published, and then the owner of the data contacts the journal to indicate that there is a problem. And finally, when it comes to image and data issues, we do not have any tools available for PLOS that carry out a systematic analysis of all articles that have been submitted. So we are very much dependent on people raising these issues with us. That being said, as you might remember from the previous slides, the most common issue that leads to an expression of a concern or retraction within PLOS are image concerns. And among the image concerns, the biggest topic are gel and block data concerns. So to try and help address these issues earlier on, ideally during the assessment, but also potentially to make sure that the data is still available years after an article has been published, both PLOS One and PLOS Biology have introduced a policy in July 2019 that requires authors to submit the original uncropped images that underlie blot and gel results. Especially, this is very helpful for studies where concerns may be raised years after. We sometimes find that concerns are raised for articles that are 10 years or older. And if we then reach out to the authors and ask for the original blots, they may no longer be available. And that is not to say that the authors committed fraud or that any deliberate misconduct has taken place. But in the absence of the original blots, we are not able to resolve the concerns. And usually we might have to publish an expression of concern or retract the article. So by submitting this early on, we hope to be able to spot these issues earlier, but even if we don't spot them earlier, it will help us to resolve these cases should concerns be raised later on down the line. These policies are currently in place for PLOS 1 and PLOS Biology, but we are in the process of implementing the same policy across the other journals. I'm not quite sure, there might also be already implemented on the new journals. We will clarify that in the Q&A that we will send around at the end. But yeah, something exciting coming your way. So a very important thing to keep in mind is that PLOS staff will follow up on publication ethics concerns. And if you have been made aware of a publication ethics concern or you have discovered one yourself, please reach out to us. We do not expect you to handle these cases. We do expect you to let us know so that we can look at them. So when it comes to publication ethics at PLOS, there are different groups involved, and I'll give a breakdown of the different roles and responsibilities of each team. So the publication ethics team at PLOS currently consists of 3 senior editors, including myself. We all have a scientific background. We have several years, or in some cases many years, of editorial experience, and we all have expert knowledge of publication ethics, standards and policies across the journal and across the industry. We will follow up on severe publication ethics cases as well as most post-publication cases. We also handle all of the retractions and all of the expression of concerns, and we will be involved in the drafting of these notices. We will also be involved in drafting publication ethics policies, workflows, training, webinars, similar kind of topics. Then there are the journal staff editors. They address most pre-publication cases, as well as post-publication cases that are centered on a scientific or policy-based debates. So when there's not necessarily like an issue with the integrity of the study, but people might disagree about what's the best approach for a study. If a scientific-based concern turns into a situation where an article might have to be retracted or we might have to post an expression of concern, they will loop our team in and we will start taking over from there. The editor-in-chief or the executive editors, depending on the journal, are responsible to take the final decision on complex publication ethics cases, which includes all cases that lead to a retraction or an expression of concern. And then you, the editorial board members, are primarily contacted for scientific consultations. So this could be very early on. If concerns are raised, specifically if concerns are raised of a scientific nature and we're not quite sure if there's any merit to these concerns, that we should actually contact the authors and ask them to comment on. We will contact you to ask, is this a concern and should we look into this further? But the vast majority of the cases when we're contacting you is after we have already carried out the initial assessment. We have contacted the authors, we have pointed out the concerns, we have asked them for their response and for the underlying data, and we've done the initial editorial assessment. And then we might need your input on, for example, concerns regarding a methodology or the science. It's also possible that if we are going to issue a correction or an expression of concern where new data is being presented, that could be replicate experiment data, for example, then we will also reach out to you and ask you to have a quick look and review the new data just to make sure that it is correct and to make sure that also the new data that's published has actually been peer reviewed by a board member. We do not ask you to make a final decision on these cases. You can give a recommendation and we will take that in consideration, but the final decision on these cases lies with the editor-in-chief or the executive editors, for at least for complex cases when it comes to an expression of concern and a retraction. If we do contact you and you're not quite sure what's being expected from you, please do reach out to us and we will explain a bit further. Or if you're being contacted and you're simply unable to help, we very much appreciate it if you can let us know as early on as possible so that we can look for someone else to help us with these cases. So what kind of things do we need to look out for during peer review? The very first and foremost thing that you should look at is competing interests for yourself, for reviewers, and for authors. There's a couple of links on this slide that you can look at after this presentation that show the PLOS policy and other resources that are available on the PLOS Peer Review Center. It's very important that you check this out carefully because there may be a different understanding of what you see as a competing interest and what actually constitutes as a competing interest. So a competing interest is anything that interferes or could reasonably be perceived as interfering with the full and objective presentation, peer review, editorial decision making, or publication of an article that has been submitted to PLOS. So Jenny, if you can bring up the poll question here, please. If you can answer multiple choice questions, so multiple answers are required, which of these items you think should be declared as a potential or competing interest?
Just going to give everyone 5 more seconds and then we'll end it.
Right, so we'll go through the poll questions, especially for the recording, because people can't actually see the poll. So per the PLOS policy, which of the following are considered potential competing interests? You conduct research in the same field. We would usually expect you to conduct research in the same field because we need an expert within the field. So this is not necessarily a conflict of interest. However, if you are working as a direct competitor of the authors, then we do ask you to refrain from peer reviewing the article. If you have served as the author's PhD advisor, then yes, this is definitely a competing interest and please refrain from reviewing. I mean, if it has been 15, 20 years, it probably may not be an issue, but still it is probably best to just refrain from peer review or from handling the manuscript. You are at the same university as the authors, but you are in a different department. It is very possible that you work in the same institute, but that it's a very big institute and you don't know the individual, and that is fair. But unfortunately, we as editors, but also the readers, cannot know for certain whether or not you know the individual personally. So therefore, we would ask you to recuse yourself from the peer review process, because although it may not be a competing interest and you may well be able to carry out an objective assessment, it could be perceived as a conflict of interest. If you're friends with the authors, then yes, definitely refrain from handling the manuscript. If your research is funded by the same agency as the reporter's research, then that is usually fine. And we usually, you can just carry on and handle the manuscript. If you are listed on a patent that is relevant to the reported research, then yes, definitely a competing interest, and do not refrain from handling the manuscript. And if you have co-authored with an article, with the authors on an article over 8 years ago, then we would usually see this as okay. So PLOS handles a 5-year window for competing interest regarding co-authorship. And so if an article is more than 5 years old and you haven't worked with the authors within those last 5 years, then it is usually okay to handle a manuscript. However, if you think that there might be a reason why in this specific case people might raise concerns, then do please refrain from handling the manuscript. An important issue here that people may or may not be aware of is that if competing interests concerns are raised, if it turns out there is a competing interest between the handling editor and the authors after an article has been published, then we may need to ask for a new peer review on the article. And sometimes this could lead to an expression of concern or even a retraction of the article. So it's better to be open and honest about it beforehand. And if you're not quite sure, just reach out to the journal, explain the situation, and we will have an assessment to determine whether or not it's okay for you to proceed handling the manuscript. Next slide, there we go. So there are other issues besides competing interest that you need to look for during peer review. And these include things such as the concerning peer review, reviewer behavior, research ethics issues, and image integrity issues or other data concerns. And we will be talking through these 3 topics in the next few slides. So firstly, conduct of the academic editor is a very important issue to address. We have an expectation that all academic editors uphold high ethical standards for yourself, as well as that you expect that from the reviewers and from the authors. And therefore there is a code of conduct on the PLOS website that lays out the expectations. I think the document is relatively new, so if you've been on the PLOS journal for a long time, it might be worth checking this out if you haven't seen it yet. So here's a few excerpts from the Academic Editor Code of Conduct that is fully available on the PLOS website. I think there might be a link on the slides, but definitely there will be a link for you when we share the recording around. And the Code of Conduct will include some standard expected comments, such as to ensure that you abide by the highest standards that are set within the scientific community. To make sure that you facilitate peer review without any self-interest, and to make sure that you are aware of the ethics for peer reviewers and alert the journal of any concerns, to make sure that you handle all of the articles that are under consideration with confidentiality, etc. However, there's also a couple of items that I'd like to draw your attention to, specifically item F and G, that are very important topics regarding equity and inclusion. So at PLOS, we expect you to keep in mind diversity, equity, and inclusion, to make sure that you are aware of your own bias, including your own unconscious bias, and how this might affect the way that you assess an article. So try and be inclusive and encourage others to be inclusive as well, and try and prevent any bias towards groups or individuals or certain religions. And so to make sure that basically PLOS's values are being upheld across the manuscript, across the handling of the manuscripts, to make sure that all of the individuals are treated with kindness and with respect. And if there's any potential issues of bias or discrimination, please do flag them to the journal so that we can look into this a bit further. So what to keep an eye out for when it comes to reviewers. Firstly, it is important to make sure when you are selecting reviewers that you check very carefully to make sure that these reviewers are, that the contact details are genuine. Some of the PLOS journals allow authors to suggest reviewers. And especially when you're using suggested reviewers, it's very important to double check the email addresses, the contact details, the institutional details, the potential conflicts of interest, and similar information. It's also, if at all possible, please make sure that you don't rely solely on peer reviewers that have been suggested by the authors, but make sure that at least one of the peer reviewers is selected independently of the author recommendations. Please also be aware of duplicate review content from independent reviewers. We want to have an independent view from multiple people, and if reviewers work together on an article, then there's no longer independent review. So if there's any concern that there is entire blocks of text that are identical between the two reviewers that have been invited, then please do contact us so that we can look into this a little bit closer. Please keep an eye out for citation stacking, which is a process where reviewers are asking the authors to include references of the reviewer's own work. Now, obviously, it could very well be that there is a highly relevant article from the reviewer that should be included in the article and that should be cited. And if the reviewers provide scientific justification, good scientific justification for this article to be included, then that's acceptable. But if there is a lot of articles that the reviewer asks the authors to include and there is no real scientific justification for these articles to be included, then please do let us know and we can look into this a bit closer. And it's also important to keep in mind that if you find a peer review report where there are comments that are perhaps biased or sexist or derogatory or discriminating in any other way, then please do reach out to the journal so that we can look into this. We may contact the reviewer and ask them to edit these comments and remove them, especially as they're usually they have no scientific contribution to the review. And in some cases, we may decide to edit those comments out and let the reviewer know that we have done so to ensure that our authors are being treated fairly and without any, they don't have to deal with these kind of derogatory comments. And then finally, if you come across any other concerns, dual submissions, salami slicing, data ownership, authorship, whichever, just refer these concerns to the PLOS staff. Do not start your own assessment of, or like don't start this case yourself. Don't reach out to the authors to discuss these. Please reach out to us so that we can follow according to our standard procedures to make sure that all of these cases are being handled in a fair and consistent manner across the journals. Just a little game really here. So there's a couple of images where concerns have been raised. So if you can have a look at these images and then we will pull up a poll question. Jenny, feel free to pull up the poll question where you can indicate how many issues you can spot. You can also drag the poll box around on your screen so you can look at what's underneath. Whenever you're ready to submit them, Jenny.
We've got the last couple of people who are still reviewing. I'll just give them a couple more seconds.
Yeah. Right. So the results of the poll show that the most popular topic is 0 to 2 issues, followed by 3 to 5, followed by 6 to 7, and none of you see 8 or more issues. So when we're looking at this a bit more closer, the top left panel you can see that there are some splice lines over in the IRF panel between lane 1 and 2 and lane 2 and 3. And if you're looking more closer at the GAPDH panel, you can see there is a splice line here right in the middle. Splice lines may not necessarily be a problem if the authors can provide the underlying blots to show that these have been all spliced from the same blot and they are all compatible. But they should be declared in the manuscript when they're being published. And ideally, we would want authors to show splice lines by putting in vertical black lines to make it very clear to the reader that the data are not consistent, like that the blots have been spliced. Now, if you're looking at the panel and the blot on the bottom left, you can see that there is some duplications there, including the 2 at the very end of the top panel, and then 3 bands over in the bottom panel that are very similar. Within panel duplications are usually more concerning, and it's less likely that these can be resolved with a positive outcome, as these are more likely to be inappropriate figure manipulation. Again, may not be deliberate misconduct, but it is a kind of breach of the image integrity policies that the journal has in place. And then if you're looking at the right, there were 4 panels that were presented as independent samples. But when you're looking at them more closely, it seems that all of these 4 panels overlap in such a manner that they might actually originate from the same underlying image, and therefore cannot be representing 4 independent scientific, 4 independent samples. So when you're looking at these kind of concerns, we specifically would ask you to keep an eye out for the splice lines, which are usually a bit more easy to spot, and have a look over blots to try and make sure that there's no duplications. But we are very well aware that this takes a trained eye. The more you look at these kind of issues, the easier it becomes to spot. But at the same time, we as publication ethics editors see these every day, so it is easier for us, whereas you may not come across issues like these at all, or very rarely. So we do not necessarily expect you to spot them all, but if you do spot them, or if you're made aware of them, then please do reach out to us. And if you're concerned about an image, but you're not sure, then you're always welcome to reach out to us during the peer review process, and we will have a look. So there's another polling question. Jenny, if you can pull that one up. So on this polling question specifically, there is a hypothetical situation where US researchers report a study that has been conducted in an African village that involves human participants. The authors obtained IRB approval from their US institute, and they obtained informed consent from the participants. From an ethics perspective, is it okay to proceed with this article?
Just going to give everyone 10 more seconds there.
Right, so the majority of you will say that this is not correct, this is not sufficient, and that is correct. In these kind of cases, this study is carried out abroad, and therefore you need local ethics approval and sometimes local research permits. So just obtaining ethics approval from your own institute when a study is being carried out abroad is usually not sufficient. It is worth reaching out to the authors here, because it is very well possible that the authors have obtained the right ethics approvals and local permits, but they've just not declared it in the manuscript. So it's not necessarily something that they haven't done, it might just be something that they haven't declared in the manuscript. So publication ethics concerns impact a small minority of our submissions and an even smaller number of our publications. However, they do have a major impact on the researcher's reputation, or they can have a major impact on the researcher's reputation, as well as the public trust in science. And also these incorrect studies may affect future research direction or funding or policies that are being drawn based on these studies. So it is important that the journal upholds its responsibility to ensure the reliability and the integrity of the published record. And again, as we state, it's really important to keep in mind that the vast majority of these cases are simply an error or misunderstanding and not necessarily fraud. And it's the journal's responsibility to ensure the integrity of the public record, but it is not our role to adjudicate on intent. And this also falls beyond our remit. So we will not look at the intent behind these issues. We will just try and make sure that they're resolved so that the published record is updated correctly. So the main take-home message for today's webinar is, if you become aware of any publication ethics concerns, either during the assessment of the article or after an article has been published, contact PLOS. We have an email address that is on here, pubethics@plos.org, and contact us. If someone reaches out to you, just refer them to us and we will look into this matter. So notify the journal of any issues. Do not investigate this yourself or discuss it with the authors. Just contact us and we will look at it. And if we need your input on the case, we will make sure to reach out to you. You maintain the code of conduct and consider publication ethics standards and policies during your peer review, also obviously for your own articles when you submit them. But you can really help us if we do need scientific consultations. If we reach out to you with scientific requests about articles where publication ethics have been raised, please help us out. Have a look at these consultations, and if you're not able to help, please let us know as soon as possible so that we can continue to look for someone else. And again, if you're contacted about an issue by a reader, by a journalist, whoever, just forward the issues to the journal office and we will respond to these issues. So there is some more information about the PLOS policies pertaining to publication ethics. You can find these among the policies on the webpage. This includes the human ethics and animal research ethics, competing interest statements, and what is considered as competing interest. And there's also a specific page on ethical publishing practice. So you can look at these sources and have a bit of a read. If you're not quite sure whether something is a breach, perhaps you might want to look at the resources first and then contact the journal. And there's also a whole page on figures. What are the correct practices when you're preparing a figure, and what is expected from authors when they report on their figures. So you can look into there and see what the requirements are and what our policies are. And then further, there are some other publication ethics resources, such as the PLOS One Editor Center. This is not just for PLOS One editors. Editors from other PLOS journals can also use this resource, but do keep in mind that the policies on your journals may be slightly different. So if you're not quite certain, reach out to journal and we will discuss these issues. Then there's the PLOS Reviewer Center. There is the code guidance and flowcharts that I mentioned before. And you can also go to the Embassy of Good Science, which is another international organization that works very hard to uphold the integrity of scientific publications across the world. That has a lot of good information that is not specifically to PLOS, but that is good guidance that is good to follow. And with that, I would like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm sorry that we've run very late, but there is still some time for questions. If there's any questions, please throw them our way, and the ones that we don't get to address right now, we'll make sure to send around in a document afterwards.
Hi Maria, just like I said, in the interest of time, I'm just going to grab one or two questions from the poll or the chat just to promote to you. So there's been one question here about can an academic editor decide to leave out parts of a peer review report if it's deemed insufficient quality or breaches the ethics code?
If you want to leave out parts because of such topics, please do contact the journal staff editor. I'm not certain if an editor can actually edit the review, and it is better for us to make sure that the reviewer is aware of it. But if there are genuine concerns regarding the quality of the peer review and whether the concerns are scientifically valid or discriminating or whatever, then definitely do reach out to us and we can take actions on those reviews and edit parts of it if necessary. Yes.
There's another question here. If a deliberate image manipulation issue arises and is rejected for this reason, is there any follow-up in case the authors simply send the same elsewhere?
Yeah, for any rejections regarding image concerns where we genuinely think there has been misconduct, we will reach out to the Institute and we will discuss it with the Institute. Whether or not the Institute takes any action depends on the Institute. Obviously, that's beyond our remit. And it's the same for any retractions. So when we retract an article, we will always inform the Institute and they can then spend some time investigating if they want to. It's sometimes possible that the Institute contacted us about it in the first place, but we will always make sure that the institutes are informed.
And one last one, how will an academic editor be able to assess salami slicing?
Salami slicing is a tricky one. Because it can sometimes not really come to light until multiple articles have been published. But especially when you're looking at a genomic study and there is only 1 or 2 genes, then you can have a look at whether there is a scientific justification for writing a paper on just those 2 genes, or whether you feel that really there should have been more information. If it is an other study type, then a lot of it will depend on your expertise, on whether you feel that there is sufficient information in that article for it to be an independent study. If you are concerned, you can reach out to the journal. We can contact the authors to discuss it further and also make it very clear to the authors that if this does get published, but it turns out that it was salami sliced afterwards, we may still retract the article for salami slicing. So we make it very clear to the authors that this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, and we will usually ask them to submit a copy of their other submissions to other journals so that we can carry out an assessment. Then we might reach out to you as well as an academic editor and say, do you think that there is sufficient reason for these to be separate articles or not?
Right, that's all.
Brilliant. Well, once again, thank you very much for joining, and I hope this has been useful.